let's have a totally hypothetical conversation about purely fictional politics. This is a story of a power-hungry leader with a huge sphere of influence and an even huger ego, blaming an entire group of people for the transgressions of a small handful of people and wreaking devastating retribution that held an entire community in terror for years. I am, of course, talking about King Minos, the father of the Minotaur, and the ruler of the island that is now known as Crete, but was once home to a very interesting civilization called the Minoans that existed and fell prior to the events of the actual Trojan War. It all started when Minos' son Androgeus went to compete in the Pan-Athenian Games and absolutely dominated, to the point where one of two things happened. One, he was unalived by a group of jealous Athenians, or two, King Aegeus of Athens may have sent him to fight the Marathonian bull, which was a death sentence from the get-go, and he was mauled to death by this bull. King Minos, as you can imagine, was not particularly pleased with this and demanded retribution from Athens. Now, it just so happens that shortly before this, King Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, was struck with a curse from Aphrodite to fall in love with a bull. So she went to Daedalus, the royal inventor, and asked him to build her basically the world's first fursuit, and got in touch with her persona, and 9 months later gave birth to a Minotaur, which is a half-man, half-bull monster. So on the advice of the oracle at Delphi, Minos conscripted poor Daedalus into building a labyrinth to imprison the Minotaur in. So when King Minos approached King Aegeus and demanded the lives of the people who unalived his son, and King Aegeus had absolutely no idea who the perpetrators were, Minos was like, well, I just so happen to have a man-eating monster in my basement. So as an alternative to the actual perpetrators being punished, he demanded that 14 young people from Athens every year would be surrendered to Crete to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. Now, the myths aren't necessarily clear on what this looked like, but I would imagine instead of the Minotaur just having an epic feast of 14 human beings at once, it's more than likely that these youth had to wander around the labyrinth of Crete and be hunted by the Minotaur throughout the year, which is terrifying. So in addition to the, unaliving of actual human beings, this basically waged psychological warfare on the people of Athens, because every single year they had this Hunger Games style nightmare looming over them. Now, we're going to get into some actual history here, but please bear with me because this is really interesting. The Minoans did have written records, but they're in a script called Linear A, which to this day has not been deciphered by anyone. So all we have to go off of to piece together what Minoan civilization looked like is artifacts and myths. In fact, if you've ever wondered why people are so obsessed with Greek mythology, this is why. During the Greek Dark Ages, language vanished. There was no language and therefore no written records during the Greek Dark Ages. And therefore, once written language resumed, we had all of these myths about what life looks like in the Bronze Age and no actual written stories that anyone was able to read. So, the stories associated with like Theseus and Perseus and the Trojan War, as passed down orally through generations, was all they had left of that history. And that is more or less why Greek mythology is such a big deal, particularly stories from the Age of Heroes. So keep in mind that modern day scholars of ancient studies will burst into flames if they're not arguing about something. There's a lot of debate over what we can piece together about Minoan culture, but there are a few things we know for sure. Number one, they had a fantastic navy. Number two, they had huge and very intricate palaces. Number three, these palaces in question had huge stockpiles of goods from everywhere, from local items produced in Crete to imported goods from places like Egypt. This suggests that trade and distribution of goods was entirely regulated through the palaces and therefore through the ruling class. In addition, when I say these palaces were huge and intricate, I am not exaggerating. In fact, I might be understating just how epic and massive these palaces were. When you look at a floor plan of the palace at Knossos, you can see why the ancient people would have interpreted this as a labyrinth. This diagram of what that palace would look like with no roof drives the point home even further. Now, the decline of this epic civilization started around the mid-1400s BC, and around that same time, the place that is now Athens was a major Mycenaean stronghold. As I've mentioned in other videos, Mycenae was obsessed with conquering and with controlling trade of the Aegean. From what we can tell, I don't think they did the greatest job of it, because ultimately when they did colonize Crete, they weren't there for that long, but they were just really into the idea of colonizing Crete. So, the story of Theseus coming and slaying the Minotaur, this huge, all-consuming entity, could very well be a metaphor for the Mycenaeans coming and conquering Crete. The large ships that showed up in Athens annually to take 14 youths back to Crete would be representative of the Navy, which is thought to have engaged in a lot of piracy. We also have record of Minoan artifacts as far up as Anatolia, so we know they were a major figure in trade along the Mediterranean. So this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but I would imagine that in the story of Theseus, the tribute of youths from Athens to Crete would be representative not only of goods being stolen, but more than likely of actual Athenian or Mycenaean people being taken prisoner and brought back to Crete as forced laborers, etc. So just to recap, we have an overpowered leader with an overfunded army and a penchant for conquering and invading places who focuses their efforts on one particular group of people, blaming the masses for the transgressions of a handful of people and feeling entitled to displace people from the places where they have lived their entire lives, just because they can. And the actual actions of this leader definitely were very bad, but the psychological torture that he inflicted on these people was immense. And the only way to stop it was not through peacefully negotiating, but by defeating their means of control, which is to say their mass killing machine. And the only way they were able to achieve this was by infiltrating the power structure from the inside. You know, hypothetically, in fiction, of course.